Right. So you know how sometimes you think back to high school and, like, remember that kid who just always had to push everyone's buttons, especially about sensitive stuff?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Well, picture that kid all grown up and now he's, like, whispering in the president's ear.
Oh, wow.
Kind of wild, right?
Yeah.
That's basically Stephen Miller.
Yeah.
And today we're going to take a deep dive into how he went from, like, a controversial high schooler to the guy behind some of the Trump administration's most divisive immigration policies.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah. So right off the bat, it's kind of ironic, right?
Uh-huh.
His own family, they were Jewish immigrants from Belarus,
Huh.
fled persecution, came to America for safety.
Right.
And then here he is years later trying to make it harder for others to do the same thing.
Yeah, that is a striking contrast.
Okay, so to figure this whole thing out,
Yeah.
we've got a ton of stuff to go through, articles, videos, even some interviews.
Okay.
It's like solving a puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of getting a pretty picture at the end, we're trying to understand how one guy's ideas can, like, shake up a whole nation.
Yeah. Definitely a puzzle worth solving.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, one piece of this puzzle that really jumped out at us is this video where Miller's talking about immigration.
Okay.
And he's, like, all about sealing the border and deporting all the illegals.
Wow.
It's a pretty stark example of his rhetoric, you know? Very black and white, good versus bad.
Right.
He doesn't shy away from that kind of loaded language at all,
Yeah.
which to some, might sound inflammatory.
Understandably, yeah.
Yeah. And speaking of inflammatory, there's this clip from a Forbes breaking news interview.
Yeah. Okay.
And the audience actually applauds when he says, deport all the illegals.
Wow. Seriously.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. It makes you think about, like, what kind of political climate allows a statement like that to get cheered.
It does make you wonder. It suggests that there's a segment of the population that feels unheard, maybe even threatened by the changes happening around them. And Miller's words, they offer a sense of control, a way to fix things quickly. He becomes a voice for their anxieties, even if the solutions he proposes are oversimplifications of these incredibly complex issues.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good reminder that words have power, especially in politics. They can be used to simplify things, but they can also be used to distort them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, there's another source that really digs into Miller's background.
Okay.
It's a video by Democracy Now! Called The Stephen Miller Story, from pestering Latino students in high school to drafting Muslim ban.
Huh. Interesting title.
Yeah, it goes way back to his high school years, and honestly, some of the stories are pretty hard to believe. Like, he's telling Latino students to speak English, which, kind of echoes that whole assimilation versus multiculturalism debate that's still going on today.
It's interesting how you can see those early signs of the views he'd later champion. It's like even as a teenager, he had this vision of a stricter, more homogenous America.
It really makes you think how much of our adult selves are formed by those teenage experiences, right?
Oh, that's a great question for our listeners to consider, actually. How have your own experiences shaped your views on immigration, on what it means to be American?
Yeah, good point.
And how did those views compare to what Miller's putting forward?
Okay, so let's go back to those high school years for a second. There's this video clip of Miller giving his speech during a student election. And he makes a comment about janitors that a lot of people found offensive.
I see.
Especially because most of the school's janitorial staff were people of color.
That's pretty problematic.
Yeah, it's often brought up as an early example of how Miller would use language that some people might perceive as like insensitive or even hostile towards minority groups.
Yeah, definitely not a good look.
It really raises questions about where his views on race and class came from.
Right.
And whether these early patterns of behavior kind of foreshadowed the political positions he'd take later on.
Interesting.
So let's break down this janitor incident a bit.
Okay.
What exactly did he say?
Yeah, what was the context? I mean, high school kids can be clueless, but this seems a bit more than that.
Right. So in the video, he's talking to a crowd of students, and he starts complaining about being sick and tired of being told to pick up my trash when plenty of janitors are paid to do it for us.
Yeah, on the surface, it could just be a teenager being flippant, but...
Exactly. But then you consider the fact that most of the janitors were people of color.
It takes on a different meaning, doesn't it? It's not just about laziness anymore.
Right.
It hints at something more, like maybe a disregard for the people he considers beneath him, those who do jobs he thinks are menial. It makes you wonder if even back then there was an element of looking down on certain groups of people.
That's a pretty disturbing thought. And it wasn't an isolated incident either, right?
Right.
There were reports from former classmates saying he would tell Latino students, "This is America, speak English."
Wow.
It's almost a direct line to his later push for assimilation.
Yeah, it really does seem like a consistent pattern.
It's almost like those teenage opinions became the foundation for his entire political career.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
And what's even more interesting is that Miller went to high school in Santa Monica, California.
Right.
Not exactly a place known for traditional conservative values.
Definitely not.
So maybe growing up in that kind of diverse, liberal environment actually fueled a sense of rebellion in him,
It's possible, yeah.
like a need to push back against the norms.
Could be. Maybe these clashes, these moments of friction, were his way of figuring out where he stood in the world, even if it meant being provocative or offensive.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. It also makes me think about the role of mentors in shaping someone's beliefs.
For sure.
Because Miller had a mentor who really reinforced his worldview, a guy named David Horowitz.
Okay.
They met while Miller was at Duke University.
Interesting.
Horowitz was a former leftist who became a really hardcore conservative.
Oh.
And he was a major guiding force in Miller's intellectual development. He gave Miller a way to understand and articulate his conservative views, especially on things like multiculturalism, and what Horowitz saw as the dangers of the liberal left.
So it sounds like Horowitz basically gave him the vocabulary and the arguments to back up his already strong opinions.
Yeah, kind of like he gave him the tools to weaponize them.
In a sense, yes, Horowitz's influence on Miller's thinking can't be overstated.
Right.
He basically provided Miller with the intellectual ammo he needed to wage his own culture war. Horowitz saw America as like engaged in a battle for its soul, a battle between traditional values and this liberal agenda that he thought was a threat to the nation's identity and future.
Yeah, and it seems like Miller really absorbed those ideas, that sense of urgency, like America was in peril and he needed to step up and fight.
Yeah, it's a powerful motivator for sure.
Now, before we get too deep into his later career, there's something else that happened at Duke that seems to have really solidified his distrust of what he saw as liberal bias, the Duke lacrosse scandal.
Oh, right. Yeah, I've heard about that.
So this was a really big deal.
Yeah.
3 members of the Duke lacrosse team were falsely accused of sexual assault.
Ah.
And Miller became one of their most vocal defenders.
Yeah.
He was adamant that they were victims of a rush to judgment fueled by political correctness and a disregard for due process.
I see.
And this seems to have been a major turning point for him. It really hardened his stance on the dangers of liberal ideology.
Yeah, it makes sense. This incident would have totally reinforced his belief that conservative values were under attack.
Right.
And that he needed to fight back against this liberal agenda that he thought was going to undermine America's core principles. It was like a call to arms for him.
Wow.
It really solidified his sense of purpose and made him want to get into politics and make a difference.
So we've got this picture of Miller emerging, right?
Yeah.
A young guy, already super conservative, mentored by this prominent right-wing figure, and deeply affected by this huge college scandal.
It's quite the combination.
And it's all driven by this belief that America is under attack, that traditional values are being eroded, and that he needs to be like this warrior to save the nation.
It's a powerful narrative, and one that resonates with a certain segment of the population.
Absolutely. But it can also be really dangerous when you combine it with political power.
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of political power, that's exactly where Miller headed after college. Straight to Washington, D.C., ready to put his ideas into action.
So what was his first move?
Well, he landed a job in the office of Senator Jeff Sessions.
Jeff Sessions, huh?
Yeah, you know, the staunch conservative, super hardline stance on immigration.
Oh, right. Yeah, I remember him. It seems like a pretty perfect fit for Miller.
Talk about finding your tribe, right?
Definitely.
Working for Sessions gave Miller a platform to really hone his skills, make connections, and develop policies that actually aligned with his worldview. This is when he really started to make a name for himself as a rising star in the conservative movement.
So it was like his training ground for what was to come.
Exactly. And then, of course, comes the Trump campaign.
Enter Donald Trump.
Right. This is where Miller finds his ultimate platform. A candidate who actually shares his views on immigration and who isn't afraid to use inflammatory rhetoric.
Yeah, they were definitely on the same wavelength.
It was like a match made in, well, maybe not heaven, but definitely somewhere in the realm of political opportunism.
For sure.
Miller saw in Trump a way to make his ideas a reality, to implement the policies he'd been working on for years.
And Trump saw in Miller someone who could actually get him elected.
Exactly. He was a brilliant strategist, a master communicator who could tap into the anxieties of a certain segment of the population and turn those anxieties into votes.
Wow, so it was like this perfectly symbiotic relationship.
Definitely one that would have huge consequences for American politics and for the lives of countless immigrants.
Yeah, no doubt about that.
So let's dive into those consequences, because once Trump is elected, Miller becomes a key advisor in the White House.
I see.
With a ton of influence over immigration policy. He's basically considered the architect behind some of the administration's most controversial actions. The travel ban, the reduction of refugee admissions, the push for a border wall.
Wow, so he was really at the center of it all.
Yeah, his time in the White House really marked a major shift in U.S. immigration policy.
In what way?
Well, his approach was all about enforcement deterrence and this much narrower definition of who should be allowed into the country.
I see.
And a lot of his policies were put into place through executive orders.
Really?
Yeah, basically bypassing the usual legislative process.
Wow, so that led to a lot of legal challenges.
Oh, tons.
Yeah.
And accusations that he was overstepping his authority.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the impact of his policies is still being debated today.
Oh, I'm sure.
Supporters point to things like a decrease in illegal immigration and increased border security,
Okay.
while critics highlight the human cost, the separation of families, and the damage done to America's reputation as a place that welcomes people seeking a better life.
Yeah, it's a complicated legacy for sure.
Definitely one that people will be talking about and arguing about for years to come.
Absolutely. And it's a legacy that's completely tied to Miller's personal journey, his worldview, and the choices he made throughout his career.
Yeah, it's like we've been tracing these threads of a tapestry connecting those early incidents in high school to the policies that ended up shaping a nation.
And it's crucial to remember that those threads are still woven into the fabric of American society.
For sure.
They're still influencing the debates we have, the policies we create, and the kind of country we want to be.
Okay, so let's zero in on a specific moment from Miller's time in the White House that really sums up his whole approach to immigration. His defense of the Muslim ban.
Oh, right, the Muslim ban. That was one of the most controversial things the Trump administration did.
Definitely. It sparked protests, legal challenges, condemnation from all over the world.
I remember.
And Miller was right out there front and center defending it, saying it was necessary to protect national security and prevent terrorism.
Yeah, but a lot of people saw that ban as being motivated by something else entirely.
Exactly. A lot of people accused him of Islamophobia and said the policy was based on prejudice and fear-mongering, not on actual evidence or a genuine concern for safety.
Right.
It's a debate that gets to the heart of what America stands for.
Absolutely. Are we a nation that welcomes people who are fleeing persecution?
Right.
Or do we shut our doors out of fear and suspicion? Do we choose security over liberty? These are tough questions with no easy answers.
For sure.
But Miller's actions seem to show that he thinks security is more important than anything else, even if it means sacrificing our values of inclusivity and compassion.
That's a pretty scary thought. And it's a reminder that the choices made by people in power have real-world consequences for millions of people.
Absolutely. Choices that are often shaped by their experiences, their mentors, and the ideas that have shaped their worldview.
Exactly. So as we keep digging into Miller's story, it's important to keep that broader context in mind.
For sure.
We're not just looking at the life of one man. We're exploring the forces that shape our political landscape,
Yeah.
the ideologies behind our policies, and the choices we make as a nation.
And those choices are what will determine what kind of future we create.
Absolutely. For ourselves and for generations to come.
Right.
Now let's talk about another aspect of Miller's high school years that adds another layer to this whole story.
Okay, what's that?
His interactions with a Chicano student group called Mecca.
Mecca.
Yeah. They focus on promoting cultural heritage and pride among Chicano students.
Oh, I see.
And according to the Democracy Now!, Video Miller has some pretty intense run-ins with them.
Really? Like what?
Well, it sounds like he would actually go to their meetings and then stand outside harassing members as they were leaving.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah, it suggests that he saw groups like Mecca, which celebrate Chicano culture and heritage, as somehow, like, incompatible with his idea of American identity.
It's almost like he viewed their cultural pride as a threat.
Right? Something to be challenged instead of accepted.
Yeah.
And that perspective, whether he was aware of it or not, seems to have influenced his approach to immigration policy later on.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like those early encounters fueled a desire to restrict immigration and limit the influence of cultures he saw as different or foreign.
It's a reminder that our early experiences, even the ones that seem small or insignificant, can have a huge impact on our beliefs and actions.
Absolutely.
especially during those high school years when we're figuring out who we are and what we believe in. It seems like those experiences with Mekaba planted some seeds that would later grow into the policies he'd champion as an adult.
It really makes you think about how our personal journeys shape our political beliefs.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. His childhood, those formative high school years, the influence of David Horowitz, his controversial time in the White House. What's the takeaway? What's Stephen Miller's lasting legacy?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
Historians and political analysts will be debating that for years to come.
Yeah, no doubt about that.
But there's no question that he's left a mark on American politics, whether you agree with him or not.
He's definitely one of those figures who people either love or hate.
Yeah, he's super polarizing. He evokes strong emotions on both sides of the aisle.
Absolutely. Some people call him a white nationalist, a xenophobe, even a modern-day segregationist.
Wow.
But then he also has a ton of supporters who see him as a patriot, a defender of American values, a voice for the people who feel like no one's listening to them.
Yeah, it's interesting how he managed to tap into such a deep vein of anxiety and resentment.
Especially among people who feel threatened by things like demographic change and globalization.
His message really resonated with people who feel like America is losing its identity, that their way of life is slipping away. And he offered them a simple solution: close the borders, keep them out, preserve this vision of America that they feel is disappearing.
And that message, amplified by the Trump presidency, has had a huge impact on the political landscape. It's fueled this rise of nativism, intensified the debate over immigration, and made the divisions in our society even deeper.
It's kind of a cautionary tale, isn't it?
Yeah, about the dangers of unchecked ambition,
Oh, right.
the allure of simple solutions to complex problems, and the consequences of dividing a nation based on fear and resentment.
His story really challenges us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves,
Yeah.
about our history, and about what kind of future we want to create.
It makes us ask ourselves, what does it really mean to be American?
Right.
Who belongs here? And who gets to decide?
These are questions that every generation has to grapple with.
Absolutely, especially as we navigate this constantly changing landscape of identity and belonging and try to figure out what it means to be American in the 21st century.
Yeah, for sure.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life and career of Stephen Miller, we're left with a lot more questions than answers.
But maybe that's the point.
Maybe it is.
His story's like a mirror reflecting our own anxieties, our own struggles to define who we are as a nation.
And it's up to each of us to look into that mirror, confront what we see, and decide what kind of future we want to build together.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's amazing how all these things, like a high school kid pushing boundaries, a college scandal, a mentorship with this super conservative guy, it all kind of comes together to shape Miller's path into politics.
Right. It's like he was collecting all the tools and armor he'd need for the battles he'd fight later on in Washington.
And a lot of those battles were fought over immigration. That seemed to be like a real hot-button issue for him.
Speaking of hot button, let's go back to that seal the border, deport all the illegals video for a sec. That clip is like a raw, unfiltered look at how he thinks about immigration. It's almost kind of scary to watch.
It's a powerful example of his style, you know? Clear, concise, and totally bold. He doesn't shy away from strong language or taking controversial stances, which clearly resonated with some people.
Yeah, like when he says deport all the illegals and people actually clap, it makes you think about how charged the whole immigration debate can get, how easily complex issues get turned into slogans.
And that's where the danger lies, right? His language, while it's effective at getting support, it also oversimplifies a really nuanced issue. It could even fuel fear and resentment towards whole groups of people.
It's like he's painting this picture of a country under attack and immigration is the enemy.
And for some people, that image really hits home, especially during times of like economic uncertainty or social change. People want easy answers to complicated problems, and Miller offers that, even if his ideas are often unrealistic or ignore the human cost.
It's a good reminder that words have consequences, especially when they're coming from someone in a position of power. That kind of language can have a ripple effect throughout society.
Absolutely. It's like throwing a stone into a pond, the ripples spread out everywhere.
So let's get back to that Democracy Now! Video of the Stephen Miller story for a minute. There's a part where they interview some of his former classmates,
Okay.
and they remember him saying stuff like, "Speak English, this is America," to students speaking Spanish in the hallways. You can't really ignore the connection to his later focus on assimilation.
It's really fascinating to see how his worldview was developing even back then. Even as a teenager, he seemed to have this very specific maybe even rigid idea of what it meant to be American, and language was a big part of that.
It's like he saw cultural diversity as a threat, something to be controlled instead of celebrated.
And that perspective, whether he was aware of it or not, seems to have shaped his approach to immigration policy down the line.
Okay, so this brings us to another important piece of the puzzle. Miller's relationship with David Horowitz. They met while Miller was at Duke, and Horowitz became his mentor. Really solidified his conservative beliefs.
Right, Horowitz, that former leftist who became a diehard conservative, he gave Miller a framework to understand and articulate his own beliefs, especially on issues like multiculturalism, which Horowitz saw as a danger to American unity.
It's almost like Horowitz gave him the intellectual tools to weaponize his opinions.
Exactly. Horowitz's influence on Miller's thinking is huge. He basically gave him the ammo to fight what he saw as a war against traditional values.
And that idea of being a warrior fighting against an enemy seems to have stuck with Miller throughout his career.
It shows up in his speeches, his policy decisions, even his personal interactions. He sees the world in black and white, good versus evil, with herself on the side of good, fighting against forces that want to destroy America as he knows it.
That's a pretty intense way to see things.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand that perspective because it helps explain why he's so dedicated to his cause, why he's willing to push boundaries, and why he doesn't care about people who disagree with him.
Okay, so we've got this image of Miller as a young man, super conservative,
Yeah.
mentored by this big-time right-wing figure, deeply affected by the Duke lacrosse scandal.
Yeah.
And it's all fueled by this belief that America is under attack, that traditional values are being destroyed, and that he needs to step up and save the day.
It's a powerful story, and it's one that resonates with a certain segment of the population, but it can also be really dangerous when you combine it with political power.
So let's talk about that. Because after college, Miller goes straight to Washington, D.C., ready to make his mark.
So what was his first move?
He gets a job working for Senator Jeff Sessions, a staunch conservative known for his hardline views on immigration. It was a match made in heaven or maybe somewhere else.
Talk about finding your people.
Right. Working for Sessions gave Miller a chance to really sharpen his skills, make connections, and develop policies that actually aligned with his worldview. This is where he started to make a name for himself as a rising star in the conservative movement.
So it was like his training ground for what was to come.
And then comes the Trump campaign. This is where Miller finds his perfect platform. A candidate who sees eye to eye with him on immigration and who isn't afraid to say controversial things.
It's like they were meant to find each other.
It was a match made in, well, maybe not heaven, but definitely in the world of political opportunism. Miller saw in Trump a way to finally put his ideas into action, to actually implement the policies he'd been working on for years.
And Trump saw in Miller someone who could help him get elected.
Right? He was a brilliant strategist, a master communicator who could tap into the anxieties of a certain segment of the population and turn those anxieties into votes.
Oh, it was a win-win for both of them.
Definitely. A relationship that would have a huge impact on American politics and the lives of countless immigrants.
For sure.
So let's talk about that impact. Because once Trump is elected, Miller becomes a key advisor in the White House with a ton of influence over immigration policy. He's considered the architect of some of the administration's most controversial moves, the travel ban, the reduction in refugee admissions, the push for a border wall.
So he was right at the center of it all.
Yeah, and his time in the White House marked a real turning point in U.S. immigration policy.
Wow, so...
His approach was all about enforcement deterrence and a much narrower definition of who should be allowed in.
I see.
And he put a lot of his policies into place through executive orders.
Really?
Yeah, basically bypassing Congress.
Wow, that's bold. So that caused a lot of legal trouble, right?
Oh, yeah. Tons of lawsuits, accusations that he was abusing his power, and the effects of those policies are still being debated today.
Oh, a bit.
Some people point to things like a decrease in illegal immigration and tighter border security. But critics focus on the human cost, families being separated, and the damage to America's reputation as a welcoming place for people seeking a better life.
It's a complicated legacy for sure.
Definitely. It's something people will be arguing about for years to come.
Absolutely. And it's a legacy that's completely tied to Miller's own story, his worldview, and the choices he made throughout his career.
It's like we've been following these threads, connecting those early incidents in high school to the policies that actually shaped a nation.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. I mean, we have to remember that those threads are still woven into the fabric of American society today.
Right, they're shaping the conversations we have, the policies we create, and the kind of country we want to be. Okay, so let's zoom in on a specific moment from Miller's time in the White House that really sums up his approach to immigration, his defense of the Muslim ban.
Right, the Muslim ban. That was one of the most controversial things the Trump administration did. It sparked protests, lawsuits, condemnation from all over the world.
And Miller was right out there defending it.
Yeah.
Saying it was necessary to protect national security and stop terrorism.
Yeah, but a lot of people saw that ban as something else entirely. They accused him of Islamophobia, saying the policy was based on prejudice and fear-mongering, not on facts or genuine concern for safety.
It's a debate that goes to the very core of what America stands for.
Totally. Are we a country that welcomes people who are running from persecution? Or do we close ourselves off out of fear? Do we choose security over freedom? These are really hard questions with no easy answers.
For sure.
But Miller's actions seem to show that he believes security is more important than anything else, even if it means sacrificing our values of inclusion and compassion.
That's a scary thought. And it reminds us that the decisions made by people in power have real-life consequences for so many people.
Absolutely. Decisions that are often shaped by their own experiences, their mentors, and the ideas that have formed how they see the world.
So as we keep digging into Miller's story, it's important to keep that in mind.
For sure.
We're not just looking at the life of one man. We're looking at the things that shape our political landscape, the beliefs that drive our policies, and the choices we make as a nation.
And those choices are what will determine what kind of future we build for ourselves and for future generations. It's kind of wild how Miller's story connects with all these big debates going on in America right now.
Totally. Immigration, national identity, what it actually means to be American.
It's like his whole career is a reflection of all these societal anxieties, these arguments about who we are as a nation, and he's become like a lightning rod for both sides.
And, thinking back to that Democracy Now! Video, the Stephen Miller story, it's clear these tensions were already there inside him, even in high school. There's this one incident that really jumps out. His interactions with Mancha, the Chicano student group. They're all about promoting cultural heritage and pride.
Okay.
And the video suggests that he would actually go to their meetings just to stand outside and harass members as they were leaving.
Seriously?
Yeah, it seems like he saw groups like Mecha that celebrate Chicano culture as like a threat to his idea of what it means to be American.
So their cultural pride was something to be shut down, not accepted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can kind of see how that perspective might have influenced his approach to immigration policy later on.
It's like those early encounters fueled this desire to restrict immigration and limit the influence of cultures he saw as different or foreign.
Right. It's a good reminder that even those early experiences, the ones that seem small or insignificant, can actually have a huge impact on our beliefs and actions.
Absolutely, especially during those high school years when we're still figuring out who we are and what we believe in. It's like those experiences with MA planted these seeds that would later grow into the policies he championed.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. His childhood, his high school years, David Horowitz, his time in the White House. What's the big takeaway? What's Stephen Miller's legacy?
Well, that's a question that people will be debating for a long time.
For sure.
There's no doubt he made a mark on American politics, love him or hate him.
He's a divisive figure, that's for sure.
Totally. He triggers strong reactions on both sides.
Right. Some people call him a white nationalist, a xenophobe, even a segregationist. But then others see him as a patriot, someone who's protecting American values, a voice for the people who feel like they're not being heard.
It's interesting how he managed to tap into that feeling of anxiety and resentment.
Especially among those who feel threatened by things like demographic changes and globalization.
Right. His message really connected with those who think America is losing its way, that the values they grew up with are disappearing. And he gave them this simple solution. Close the borders, keep them out, preserve this vision of America that they feel is slipping away.
And that message, boosted by Trump's presidency, has really changed things. It's fueled this rise of nativism, intensified the debate over immigration, and divided our society even more.
It's a reminder that ideas have power.
Totally.
That mentors can have a huge influence.
Yeah.
And that our early experiences can stick with us.
That's also a cautionary tale, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. About what happens when ambition goes unchecked. when simple solutions are offered for complex problems, when a nation is divided by fear and resentment.
It forces us to look in the mirror and ask some tough questions. What does it really mean to be American?
Right. Who gets to be a part of this country, and who gets to decide?
These are questions that we all need to think about as we figure out this whole messy business of identity and belonging and what it means to be American in today's world. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Stephen Miller, we're left with more questions than answers.
But maybe that's okay.
Maybe you're right.
His story is a reflection of our own anxieties, our own struggles to figure out who we are as a nation.
And it's up to all of us to take a good hard look at what we see and decide what kind of future we want to build together.
At The Backgrounder, we dive deep into the stories behind the headlines. We explore the people, events, and forces shaping our world, offering thoughtful analysis and insights on current affairs, politics, and social issues. Our mission is to go beyond the surface, giving you the context and background that help make sense of today's most complex and controversial topics. Do like, share, and subscribe, and share with your friends.